Hi everyone, today we are talking with Bob Moesta. He is one of the architects of the theory of jobs to be done and the author of books like Demand Side Sales, One-on-One, Learning to Build, and Job Move, which is one of the most recent books that he has released, I think, this year. So welcome, Bob. How are you doing?
Great, Ricardo. Thank you for having me on. Excited to be here to share.
Yeah, but so I typically try to start the conversation more in the personal side before going deep into theories and
Yeah,
practical
yeah.
tips for building products, which of course is important. But I think I like also to hear the human side of people,
Yes,
what people is doing besides just working
yes.
in products and so on. So maybe to start is like imagine you go today to a networking event and someone asks you who you are. So
Yes.
is this something that how would you introduce yourself
Yeah.
even with all these career achievements, but you will introduce in
I
a
usually
different way? What is
yeah. I
yeah.
usually just start with the thing is like I help people I develop product and I help people make progress. And so ultimately I just look where people are struggling in the world and try to figure out how to build new products in those spaces. And I've done it for over 3,500 different products and services in just about every industry you can imagine. And I feel like I'm very lucky, but at the same time, I realize that I've designed my life to be able to work in so many places. So I'm just honored to be here and be able to share my experiences with your audience.
Great. It's good to hear that, as you mentioned, you have designed your life for this idea, for
Yeah,
this purpose. So if you can share a bit about, yeah, what was your story of childhood?
yeah,
What makes you to start building these theories like job to
yeah.
be done? So is there
So
anything that brings you back?
yeah, so the first thing I would say is I never set out to do any of this. Like
Mhm.
I just was a normal kid. Like I would say that my mom would tell you that I was an engineer out of the womb. I was breaking things by the time I was 2 or 3 years old and fixing things by the time I was 4 or 5, primarily to just get out of trouble because I was just always so curious about how things worked. I built my first product when I was about 5. It was a parachute. It did not work. I jumped off a second-story building and broke my legs and had a concussion in the back of my head. By the time I was 7, I had 3 close head brain injuries, and to be honest, I can't read and I can't write, which I consider the greatest gifts I ever got because it forced me to learn through questions. And so, if you know the jobs to be done method, it's about interviewing and talking to people. But what happened is to be honest, I became very obsessed with asking questions and lots of questions. I was that little kid who would be really, really annoying and ask you like, why do you do that? Why does that happen? What's going on? But ultimately, it really honed me to be able to be a sponge to absorb and learn. And so, if you can't learn through books, you have to learn through experience and through conversation. And that's really where my skills have kind of honed and shined. And ultimately, when I was 18 years old, I happened to meet a gentleman by the name of Dr. W. Edwards Deming, who was the father of quality in Japan. And I asked him 52 questions in 22 minutes. Well, that's what he said. And ultimately, he thought I was one of the most curious kids he had ever met. And he asked me to be his intern for the summer. And Ford Motor Company hired me to go work with Deming in Japan to learn how to reduce product development cycle time. And so it was and that from there, everything kind of has blossomed from there. And so again, most people would look at dyslexic and ADHD as a disability, but I consider that those things actually cause me to have super abilities, which is I love to create and I love to build. And I'm
Yeah,
curious.
that sounds amazing. I think, well, since you remarked that you were working in automotive, if I remember well, maybe I'm wrong, you mentioned in one of your interviews that you were working into this idea of this icon that right now the cars have to know where the tank
I
of
guess, yeah,
gasoline
yeah.
is located.
One of the earliest times is we worked on a methodology called quality function deployment. And what it was is it's about hearing the voice of the customer, but also where the struggling moments. And one of the struggling moments that kept coming up was this notion of, I can never remember what side the gas tank is on. And so
Mhm.
eventually the fact and I experienced it when I was in rental cars. And so it was one of those things where Deming was basically saying this was a problem. I didn't really think it was a problem at the time, but Deming actually pushed us very hard to start to think about it from that perspective. And ultimately the result of that project with a bunch of people was to basically come up with the arrow to tell you which side your gas tank is on in your car. And so those are the many little things that I've done throughout my life that don't seem that important at the time, but like I'll say 50 years later, it kind of is one of those things that most people, like half the people know what it is and say thank you, and the other half of the people don't even know what it is, and now that they know what it is, they thank me again. So and it was a team effort, but it was just one of those very simple struggling moments that really articulate kind of things that people don't say they want. Most people don't know what they want, but they can articulate the struggles that they have, and out of that is where basically most innovation comes from. The way I say it is the struggling moment is the seed for all innovation. And if we can actually understand where the struggling moments lie in time and space, we can actually then figure out how to innovate.
Great. I know that, as you mentioned, you have been working in advising and operating multiple business, right? So is there any moment in time that you believe there was the highest challenge you have experienced till now, and that maybe that was the trigger to work into these ideas of jobs to be done, or how was that process?
Yeah, I think jobs to be done came from basically, so I just came back from Japan, and in Japan I had a chance to reflect, and I realized that a lot of my engineering foundations come from Japan. So people like Ishikawa and Dr. Deming and Professor Kenichi Taguchi and Kano and different people like that. And so I think part of it was there was a moment where I realized that we would talk about importance ratings and what was important to the customer. And what I realized is that importance ratings actually varied depending on the situation people found themselves in. And that at some point in time, we could average it, but the reality is averaging it just didn't seem to make sense. And so part of it was to realize in these situations, people value something different than they would in a different situation. And so that was the seed of this. In like 1989, 1990, I went through notebooks and I found some work and something that I was doing around trying to find what I would call dynamic importance. And ultimately that led to kind of the beginning of jobs to be done, is that people don't buy products, they hire them depending on the job they want to get done, and realizing that one job is different than another job, and that's that contextual kind of importance ratings. And so it really started back in 1989, but it really started to come true when in the automotive business, it was not as clear, but then I moved to the food business. And when I started to do consumer packaged goods, it became very, very clear that this was actually a powerful concept. And ultimately it started to take root from that perspective. And then I started to collaborate with Clay Christensen and some other people like Rick Peedy and John Palmer and some other people to help kind of really help, I'll say, solidify kind of the approach that we started to put together called Jobs to be Done.
So for people who don't know what is Jobs to be Done, I think one of my questions was like, can you define it from using Jobs to be Done as well? So meaning that you will try to explain us what are the struggling moments of people
Yes.
who decide to go and use Jobs to be Done, and what are the forces in place to.
So Jobs to be Done is a methodology to me. Clay Christensen turned it into a theory. And so ultimately it's seen as the fundamental theory that people don't buy products, they hire them to make progress in their life. And so out of that, being able to understand is like, when do entrepreneurs basically go and reach for this as a tool? So what's the struggling moments they have? Typically there's three underlying different jobs. One job is the fact is that they've built so I always say when I was in engineering school and basically taught to build things, they told me a lie. The lie was build it and they will come. Well, I built a lot of stuff and people didn't come because at some point I had to realize that they needed to need it, not just I needed to need it. And so you start to realize that you have to actually, once you build something, you have to realize you're actually building for somebody else. So you have to learn empathy. And so what happens is when you build something and you try to go sell it or you try to get people to use it and they don't use it, typically they don't understand where you were coming from. And so the first thing they reach for is like, we need to understand their terms and what they say and what they're struggling with and how do we modify our product to fit. Another reason why people pick up Jobs to be Done is they're starting to scale. And it's one thing to be a small team and being able to kind of have the conversation. But ultimately, as you start to listen to the voice of the customer and you understand it, you start to share it with other people in the organization. And what happens there is that you get almost the game of telephone where things get abstracted up to the wrong level, like easy or fun or fast, things like that. And it turns out that the word easy, there's like 22 different dimensions of easy. And so you start to realize that people in the organization are misinterpreting what the definition or what the customer means. And so people will reach for it because it, again, by doing jobs to be done, you get the foundation of kind of where people are coming from, what are they struggling with, and where do they want to go. And then the last one is really around this aspect of being able to understand what's next. And so a lot of times you'll actually have a product that works very well, but it's kind of like, what's the next feature set we should build? Well, most people come up with technological features and more features, but people don't necessarily use them. And so this is a tool that people will reach for when they actually want to say, well, what's the next feature I should build? Well, it's what's the next set of struggling moments people have now that you solved this last one. And so it's about using the struggling moments as the guide for the roadmap. So those are the three areas that people tend to use jobs to be done as why they hire jobs to be done to help them kind of make progress in their, I'll say, the product journey.
Is there any industry or area where you believe jobs to be done is not helpful from your perspective till now?
Yes. So the first thing I will tell you is insurance is very, very difficult, but it turns out that in most cases where there is no real choice, when people don't have a choice, it's yes or no. The fact is you find that jobs to be done, the way I would say is jobs to be done doesn't work in communism. When you have no choice and you don't really have a struggling moment and people just have to live with it, there's really no job to be done. And you can't design product for it. And so to me, it's the situations that you find yourself in where there is no choice. And there's typically, there might be a job to be done, but it can't be designed or built. And the method doesn't really work or help you in that situation because it becomes a political situation, not necessarily a choice situation.
Also, I am wondering because you have been collaborating with the guys from Basecamp, and I have read, of course, their books and stuff like that, like Rework and so on. And of course, their approach in certain moment, I don't know if they know you before their book Rework, and they were talking about scratching your own itch as a way to build a product. So has this differed for them, or you still believe this is a good approach that first you think the product from your perspective as a need that you may have? Yeah.
So I think it's two ways. I think, for example, I think there's multiple places to start. And I do believe that scratching your own itch it forces you to go down the rabbit hole to understand what the itch is, what's the struggling moment, what's really going on. And you have very strong preferences of how you want to solve that problem. So I believe that a lot of cases, you can start basically building product by scratching your own itch, but it becomes difficult when you get to a point where you now need to scratch somebody else's itch. Mm-hmm. And the way you describe the problem isn't the way they describe the problem. So all of a sudden, though you might have the same mechanism of how to solve the problem, the consumer or the customer or somebody else talks about it in a very different way. So you need to learn their language around it. So that's actually how I got involved with the people at Basecamp is they started to realize that people weren't using it just as an agency and they weren't using it just for software, but architects were using it. Medical clinics were using it. Like there are all these different people using it. And we had to actually start to think about the language as it related to kind of all these other people. And so ultimately, I think the other place that I start is where like searching for where people struggle and trying to solve their problem from their struggling perspective. And so I don't think you have to start in one or the other, but it's useful in both of those cases.
Yeah, maybe, of course, the initial 3 months, 6 months, you can scratch your own itch, and then maybe you start researching, of course, more from the other people.
Right? The thing is you might be able to build the product around your own itch, but ultimately you have to build the marketing and the positioning and understand kind of how the sales process has to work. And so ultimately you have to understand how other people buy. So there's a big difference between how we want to sell and how people want to buy. And so I approach sales from the perspective of how do we actually help people buy as opposed to how do we sell? And when you flip that lens, you start to realize like at some point, the demo is not the place where we close. The demo can be in some cases where people want to learn about it. The demo can be about showing its possibilities. The demo can be about helping me make trade-offs. But ultimately, understanding how they want to buy is the best way in which to understand how to set up your sales process.
Well, there is too many paths I can take in my next question, but I will try to make the context. Imagine I am starting a B2B tech startup today, an early stage, and then I start maybe scratching my own itch, let's say. what would be your recommendation for me or for someone else, right, who is the startup founders? What process to follow into that? So because you mentioned that, of course, the interviews are a key part of jobs to be done, right? So yeah, can you maybe in the big picture, how do you see the if there may be a process, right? How
Yes.
to approach it? Yeah, and then we can go deeper maybe into each
Yeah,
of
yeah. I
these
think
steps. Yeah.
so for me is and this is so I have 4 children and they're all in startups somewhere in the world. And
Okay.
one of the things that I talk to them about is the fact this is like one is if you have a problem and you need to scratch your own itch, that's great. But one is we don't know if that's big enough to be a business or not. But at the same time, the fact is like you should scratch your own itch on those things. But ultimately, what you want to be able to do is most people try to define a market, right? And they define a market in a very size of business, maybe the kind of business they're in, the geography that they lie in, and kind of that kind of aspect. And for me, I actually start in a very different place where I start to talk about the problem. So Ash Maori says about, don't fall in love with your product, fall in love with the problem. I actually say not only fall in love with the problem, but fall in love with the customers you want to serve. And so ultimately what I would tell you is I start by looking for where is their struggling moments, where are their pain points, where are there things where people like want to do things but they can't figure it out, right? And so ultimately, to be honest, that's where I start everything that I did. So I just wrote a new book called Job Moves. And to be honest, I'm not a career person. I've done startups. So what's interesting is I get asked all the time, like, when did you decide you wanted to be an entrepreneur? And the moment I said is the moment that I couldn't get a job, because being dyslexic and being illiterate is very hard to basically go in through HR to get a job. But the fact is I've been asking both founders and startups for a long time, what's the big top 3 problems they have that they'd love to be able to solve. And talent would always come up in that conversation. So for me, what I did is I basically said, well, how many people struggle to find the right people? Well, everybody hands go up. And then I talk to employees and talk about how many people feel it's very hard to find their next job, and they all their hands go up. And so you start to realize that there's a very big struggling moment around realizing when is it time to go, and when how do you find your next job? And so by applying the jobs to be done theory to it, what I did is I came back and said, well, how many people want to change jobs but don't know how? Turns out that's over 1 billion people a year switch jobs, right?
Wow.
And so what we did is we went off and for the last, to be honest, 10 years, I've been slowly interviewing almost like as a side gig, what causes you to leave this company to go to that company? And out of it, we found the mechanisms of what causes people to say, today's the day, I'm going to leave this company and go to that company. And what are you hoping for? And the basic frame is that employees hire companies more than companies hire employees. And ultimately, as long as the employee is making progress, they're not actually looking for another job. And so understanding what progress does the customer or your employee wants to make, and treating the employee almost like a customer is actually a really interesting angle in which you start to run HR in a very different way, because you start to realize that job descriptions are made up. We just literally ask ChatGPT to fill out the job description, and then we actually think about all the things we got to add to it. And then we try to find which makes it a very much a unicorn. And then we try to find somebody to fit that job. Well, nobody fits that job perfectly. And so then we try to make them learn new skills or do different things to fit the job. But what we're finding is what's better is actually if you know somebody what they love to do and what they're good at and what they can do well, how do I actually change the job to fit them? And now all of a sudden you have employee satisfaction. And so all of a sudden it becomes a very, very different game when you start to actually flip the lens on that. So to be honest, it's looking at the world through where there's struggling moments and figuring out how do we actually come up with ways to help people make progress. And again, I not only talk about jobs to be done, but I drink my own Kool-Aid because that's how I write all of my books.
Yeah, sounds good. So I know that you mentioned that it was part of your side gig to do these interviews. So can you give us at least some key piece of advices about how to handle those interviews? Because I know, and I have seen a lot of startup founders that they just ask, okay, would you use this feature or would you do this, right? Which is not the best way. So how would you approach the interviews?
The first thing is the interview is more about the user or the buyer, right? The customer, right? Than it is about your product. And so ultimately, one of the things I was taught when I was in Japan was I need to be able to describe requirements that are independent of the solution. So I can't talk about a feature because a feature is actually part of the product, but I can talk about what is the outcome that I want that feature to do. So when people say, oh my God, I love the calendar feature, it's not like, tell me more about the feature. It's like, tell me why that feature is useful to you. Like, what happens if I took it away? What could you do today that you couldn't do before now that you have that feature? So it's all about making sure we focus on them and what their progress is and what struggling moments they have and why does that progress look at it. So I look at it as I'm trying to, I might show them product, but ultimately I'm trying to have that product look in the mirror to basically help me understand the consumer better, not my product better. Because at some point in time, I'm not smart enough to even know what to build quite yet. So most of the time, I will say this, the older I get, the more I realize that I'm stupider and stupider every day. What I might have known yesterday that I think I really knew, I don't know. And so part of these interviews are actually starting from that premise of you really don't know why people buy your product. And that ultimately you need to actually listen to the story. So I talk about this from like one of my big mentors was Dr. Genichi Taguchi. And he would always say that the best way to learn about the customer is to listen to the customer and not bring any of your bias to it. And so he would say, start with an empty mind and let them fill your mind with what they say they're doing and gather understanding from their perspective empathetically, as opposed to trying to prove your hypotheses. So one of the things I would say is in the research, I actually have no hypotheses. I have no idea. The only thing I need to know is the fact that they decided to switch from A to B. I can't talk to people about who have just used it forever because at some point they can't tell you, they're going to make it up. And so ultimately all the real resonance comes when you talk to people who have switched. So they used to use this CRM and now they use this CRM. What caused them to change? Nobody changes randomly. And if they don't, then the fact is we should be able to understand the causes. That's how we actually understand what's going on in consumers' minds.
Great. Now, after we have made those interviews and
Yes,
getting all these stories and so on, so do you have any technique about how to detect the patterns or how to move towards translating this into actions for the product building?
I'll start with the worst thing you can do is average. Take all those interviews and average them together and find the themes across all of them. It's actually a waste of time, in my opinion. If anything, it might be the table stakes, but the reality is it doesn't actually provide me the insights. What I do is I assume that and I only do 10 to 12 interviews. And so what happens is when you look at the 10 or 12 interviews, they're all very different. But what you start to realize is that some are more similar than others. And so we start to realize that there isn't one reason why people are buying. There's several different reasons. And it plays back to the context they're in and the outcomes they want. And they're paired together. And so you start to realize that some people are about saving time and they want to save time so they can do more. Where somebody else is about saving money so they can actually invest in something else. And though they both sound very similar, they're actually very fundamentally different in terms of how they actually buy and what they're at, and the story and the story or the facts you need to come up with in order to help them convince themselves they want to buy. So part of this is in the interviews, we start to see how many different patterns do we have in the interviews and what are the underlying pathways that people have to your product. And there's typically anywhere from 3 to 6 different pathways that you start to find in these, and ultimately they become the jobs to be done or the progress that people are trying to seek. And the value code is very different between one job and another job. And one job, they value these things, and in another job, they value completely different things.
How would you describe pathways? So if you can be more deep into that, so how does it look into the research afterward? Is something like, go ahead, sorry.
So what happens is, for example, if we talk about why do people go to a conference? Right? Well, there's 4 really fundamentally different jobs why people go to a conference. One is around this aspect of I've got a problem to solve, and the people here actually will help me learn enough to actually help me go solve this problem. Another one is that I actually want to be seen. I want to go to this conference and I want people to know that I'm an expert in this area. A third job is I want to go connect and network because I'm either trying to hire somebody or I'm looking for a new job. And so you start to realize that those are three really, really different jobs. And what you have to realize is that any conference organizer has to design to fit all three of those jobs. And that sometimes he has to have enough breakout time for people to actually kind of network, right? Well, the people who want to network are almost a direct opposite of the people who want to solve a problem. They want to actually go talk to experts about something very differently. And they're not networking, they're actually doing research. And so you start to realize that not everybody can be satisfied. But the reality is that if you don't actually account for the three really different jobs, you don't know how to run the conference, right? And you end up getting complaints. And so part of this is realizing if we can understand there's three different pathways of why people come to though they all come to the same conference, they're all coming for different reasons and they have different measures of satisfaction, but there's not 100 different reasons why. It's only these three. And that's what we found over time.
And how do you suggest to convert these three pathways into the messaging and marketing strategy of the startup or in the conference in this example you're mentioning?
So in the conference example, it would be kind of like at some point you've got to be able to say, like, again, in the flyer, you have to make sure that you break it out and say, like, there's three different paths, or like there's more than enough networking time to basically talk to your friends and find new friends, right? Which is the signal for basically helping people say, like, you can look for people and you can actually find people and you might be able to find new employers. There's also the aspect of like, who are the experts that are going to be there that you can learn from so you can solve your technical problem. And so part of it is to make sure that you've actually got in the messaging, you've got enough differences between it. And sometimes you build three different flyers or three different ads. And sometimes you build one ad that actually has all three different kind of jobs embedded in it. But if you don't hit all three jobs, then what you do is you end up missing a part of the community that really wants to come.
Got it. If may I ask, because you were before also mentioning, well, in the context of startup founders, right? So of course, I understand it's important to talk about the current struggling moments and all the reasons why people would buy your product based on certain capabilities that you have. But also there is this notion that when you are pitching to investors, you need to also maybe inform the long-term, the vision of the company. So how do you balance that between the current struggling moments and the vision of the investors that maybe they want to see the long term?
So part of it is to be able to help the investors see what I call the string of struggling moments. Because so if you think of a company like QuickBooks, one of the reasons why people pick up QuickBooks for the first time is because they're usually a startup or a small business and they've been doing accounting in a very different way, and all of a sudden they have problems either in getting paid or paying other people or their taxes. And one of those three things causes them to say, we need a new accounting system. But once they actually get into the accounting system, they realize they have other problems like, oh, I need a credit card. Oh, I need payroll. Oh, I need insurance. I need like all these other things. And what you start to realize is for every struggling moment you solve, you actually then create a new struggling moment. It's like a list of all the things they want to talk about. Once they get rid of this one, and then they all move up. And then you got a new one, and then you get rid of that one, and they all move up. And so part of it is being able to help the investors understand the string of struggling moments that you can talk about, but also to realize that I can't solve all of those problems at once, and that over time I'll be able to do that. And so if you think of Intuit, which created QuickBooks, like they took from almost like 2000 to 2020, and they literally owned small business accounting and finance, and they got into the insurance side. But at some point, they were so penetrated into all the different things of small business that they looked at what's the next big struggling moment that people have besides accounting or finance. And it turns out marketing. And so they went and bought MailChimp, right? Because all of a sudden now they got the same group of people, the same kind of things, and they literally have now a new set of struggling moments they can go solve. And so they bought MailChimp at a premium because at some point in time, the fact is a lot of their companies already had it in them, but the fact is that they could expand it much easier because they were already in QuickBooks.
Exactly. I'm wondering also, because for another comment regarding pitch decks and communication with investors as well, like you mentioned that a lot of time when we start a company, we approach the market by demographics data for, I don't know, maybe some
Well, we talk about total addressable
details.
Market, right? They try to get you TAM, right? Exactly. I think TAM is a really I don't think I don't like the metric, because at some point it's trying to just give me a number of how big the market is. But the reality is there's a total addressable market, and then you have to multiply it by the percentage of people who are really struggling. Because at some point in time, like, there might be 100,000 small businesses out there, but how many are struggling with this specific problem? Probably less than 3%. And so the reality is, though we think it's this big and we can get penetration into that much, the reality is it's just not a realistic number. Now, the thing is that there are investors who basically I talk about good investors and bad investors, right? Good investors are the ones who actually understand the process. It's almost like in American football, the best coaches are the coaches who played the game. But if you talk to finance people who have never done a startup, the reality is they have all their I'll say their corporate metrics of what we have to actually hit. And they're not wrong, but the reality is they have no idea about kind of the curviness of how it is to be a startup. And the reality is being able to understand some of those things. And that the reality is the struggling moment is actually the better thing to really focus on. So again, when I wrote this book around job moves, it was really the fact is, how many people switch jobs every year? 1 billion. How many people struggle with that and aren't satisfied? That's probably 500 million. That's still a big market, but I'm not trying to get to a lot of people switch jobs and it makes sense to them and they know what to do. I'm not trying to go to those people. I'm trying to go to those people who finally get to a point and realize, like, I don't want my boss's job. I don't really like what I'm doing. I want to do something else. How do I go find out what's next? That's who I'm really going after. And so it's not the total addressable market, but it's the total addressable market that's struggling.
And how would you approach that to translate it into communication in the pitch deck, right? Because there is typically this standardized format.
I think from an investor perspective, you have to play their game. They're just like another customer. You have to speak their language. But the reality is, what you want to do is make sure you temper it, because what happens is so the way I say it is, we plan when we're the stupidest, right? And then what happens is we lay out there what we want to do. And then what happens is management holds us accountable to our stupidity. And so what I would tell you is that I would not look for investors until I actually know, basically with confidence, that this is the path to go and that the things aren't going to change. Because every time you try to pivot, the investors lose confidence in you. And the fact is they don't think you know what you're doing. But the reality is like, that's how startups are. Startups are, chock full of a lot of unknowns. And the unknowns are actually what makes it exciting for people like us, right? Exactly. And investors don't want unknowns. And so we're at odds with each other because of that. So to be honest, I like either angel investors or early on, or basically trying to bootstrap as long as I can to get to cash flow. Because ultimately the good money, what I call good money versus bad money are the people who actually have experience and can help you and actually have the knowledge to basically inject into you to help you grow faster, as opposed to just money. Like, so I just joined a private equity firm for that reason, is because we're not, let's say, just doing it to provide the money. We want to provide the expertise and knowledge that they might be lacking in the startup that they're building.
So do you have any advice about how to detect good investors from your point of view? If you have the chance to make only one question to this investor that I am interviewing today, how can I detect that this person be aligned into this concept?
I think it's more than one question, but it's using the same process of jobs to be done. Tell me about one of your best investments you've ever made and your role in it. And then tell me about one of your worst investments and your role in it. And that will tell you enough about how active they are and how they help and what they do. Because my belief is that you'll see their behavior about when things go well and when things go bad, and how they either lean in and how they lean back. And so to me, I would always ask, like, so tell me about the best investment you ever had. Tell me about the worst investment I ever had. And then ultimately from those two stories, you can start to extract the kind of help you will get, whether you're going well or not going well. Because in every startup, there's a part where you go a little bit less well, and there's a part where you go very well. And so you start to realize, like, at some point, I want the help at the right time, and I don't want no help at the wrong time.
Yeah, I get it. So thanks for that. Yeah, I have seeing startups as well, like related to sales, and maybe we can move more towards the topic of the demand side sales book and your recommendations into that. That imagine I am pitching to, or someone is trying to sell to one potential
sell your
customer,
product or your service to somebody.
Yeah. So and then typically yeah, you are pitching features after feature maybe, which is not maybe the best approach for sure. But then the customer anyways said, well, I will buy from you if you build X. So
Yeah,
if you
yeah.
build a new feature, so how would be your approach into this? Is only about the messaging from the beginning that, or is that you need to switch the audience based on these interviews that you are saying?
So typically when I'm selling, I've already done the jobs to be done. So I know what causes people to buy my product. So the first thing is I'm usually very rarely talking about my product, and they want to know more about my product, but I need to know more about them to see if they're even qualified to basically hear what I have to say. One. Two is when I understand the job that they're in, I know that there's only 3 to 5 features I need to talk about. I don't need to talk about 25 features, because at some point, nobody, based on kind of the situation they're in, this is going to be more important than these other things. The third thing is when they ask me for a feature I don't have, what I say is like, that's a very interesting feature. We don't have it. Tell me what that feature will enable you to do that you can't do today. Because 9 times out of 10, I have a way to actually solve that problem, but it's not through that feature. And so I don't ever have to go build that stupid feature, but they'll say, like, so for example, I think you talked to Ryan Singer at Basecamp, and one of the things you kept hearing all the time is, boy, we need a better calendar. You need to build a calendar. Please build me a calendar, right? And to build a calendar is a very long process, and it was a lot of money to think about. And so Ryan and I went off and started to talk to people about why do they want a new calendar? Well, it turns out they wanted a calendar so because in Basecamp, you schedule all your things, and the calendar only has the stuff that actually is what you're planning to do, right? It actually doesn't have what's available. And so what you found is people mostly saying like, you know what, I'm trying to actually see who's available to do what, and I can't see if they're available or not because you only tell me when they're going to do stuff, not when they're available. And so what Brian did is he really figured out the fact is I don't need to build a calendar. I just need to take the inverse of what people take their availability by finding out where they scheduled, do the inverse of what's scheduled and say, here's where they're available. And next thing you know, they say, oh my God, thank you for building a calendar. Well, that turned out to be 2 or 3 weeks worth of work versus 6 to 8 months worth of work. And so by understanding the real reason why they wanted the feature, we were able to come up with a way better way and easier way of implementing it on our end as well as them. And by the way, they still said, thanks for the calendar, though we never built a calendar.
Exactly. So I have seen this repeatedly that they get the feedback from a customer. Even the customer comes with a solution already, and then you jump and build
That's
that.
right.
And
That's right. Well,
at
the
the
other thing
end,
is salespeople don't understand the technical side of the business that well. And so what happens when they say we don't have that feature, they run back to product and say, I need this feature because I can sell more. And 9 times out of 10, when you add that feature, people don't buy. It's actually a misleading notion to say like, oh, if you give me that one feature, I'll buy. It almost rarely happens. That's the other thing, is to realize it's a tactic of lying from the consumer perspective.
yeah, it's that approach that, of course, they are not gonna make you feel bad to saying no. They are just
That's
gonna
right.
make an
That's right. They don't want
excuse,
to say
right?
no.
Yeah.
So, boy, if you had this feature, I'd probably buy, I'd most likely buy, but you don't have the feature. And the reality is like, it's just the way they're saying no. And so when you get it, they're like, yeah, they're going to come up with another reason. And so part of it is to actually dig past the notion of the feature to understand the outcome they're seeking from that feature. Because again, like I said, there's probably 3 or 4 ways you can get to that outcome without having to add that feature.
Great. Since you have mentioned Ryan Singer before, so and right now, so I can maybe mix this with the question I have about.
That's all right.
Yeah, I know you mentioned he is a great friend of yours,
Yeah, he's a very good
and
friend.
that you have been working together also with the J-pop framework as well. So
Yes.
yeah, can you tell us what you have learned from him and maybe what you have teach him based on your knowledge, at least in some kind of context, or maybe the similarities between J-pop and jobs to be done, because I see a lot of complementary approach here.
Yep. So I split the world into demand side and supply side, where demand side is where people pull products into their lives. And that's where jobs to be done is the language. But ultimately, jobs to be done is a systems framework to think about what causes people to say, today's the day I need this product. At the same time, the fact is shape up to me is the counterpoint on the supply side. It's the mechanism and the methodology by which to build. And the reason why I say that is that most people, when they try to build, they build out basically all the things they have to do, right? And what's very interesting to me is that that's how we're taught as engineers, is to say, like, we would build this and then we build that, and when we build this and we build that. But the reality is, what drives us as technical developers is the unknowns. It's not the knowns. And so by actually understanding the unknowns and framing the unknowns and realizing that 90% of the work is taking the unknowns and making them known, that's actually how we actually develop work. And so Ryan is about creating buckets or pathways of, here's the work we have to go from unknown to known. And then once we have the knowns, the execution part is actually the easy part. So 90% of teams will sit there and write all the things they know about the things they need to go build. And what happens is they forget about the things they don't know until the end, and then they get stuck. And so the shape up method is really about shaping the work and shaping the unknowns to be able to get to the known part as fast as possible. Because once it's all known, it's actually very easy to build. And so to me, they're almost like parallel processes that do one in the supply side and one in the demand side that interact with each other, because ultimately the demand side is going to dictate kind of the decisions you have to make about the unknowns, and ultimately being able to figure out the technological way to do something. And so I need the demand side to actually run shape up, but I need shape up to help me run the supply, the demand side. So they're interdependent systems. And I think that's one of the reasons why Ryan Singer and I are such very good friends on this, is that we have now a common language to talk across the barrier of basically supply and demand.
Yeah, I see it really important. As you mentioned, jobs to be done. I look at this point, based on what you have commented, like the output or the outcome of the jobs to be done becomes the input to shape up,
exactly,
to define the betting table, what to do and what, and
That's
then
right.
of course
That's
there is
right.
the product side, right?
But then the output of the other part is the output of the shape up system is the product that then feeds the sales system that actually helps me go help people make progress. So it's circular in nature, but the fact is you need to start with the struggling moment, and then the struggling moment leads to the jobs lead to shape up, and then shape up leads up to sales.
Yeah. Because I see that we, in general, one of the most, let's say, methods to build products right now is agile and Scrum
Yes.
and these processes. So, but right now, if I'm be honest, I will only work in companies working with jobs to be done and shape up, at least from my perspective, right? So
It's easy. It's easier, and I don't think Agile's wrong, but I think it's a great evolution from waterfall. And I think the fact is that it learns some skills, but like every method, I believe that jobs to be done and shape up are also limited in some way, and over time there'll be a better method. But I think part of this is to think about how does our development approach change through time and space. And so again, if you're just building lists, like, Agile's way better than that. If you're doing waterfall, Agile's way better than that. But at some point, Agile has this notion of being able to break everything into tasks and just kind of put it through the paper shredder. And then it assumes when you put it back together, it works, and it doesn't in very complicated systems. And so you start to realize there's some limitations to it. And so you have to actually take a step forward in a different way. And shape up is the next evolution to me of Agile.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, I am wondering, well, I assume Ryan Singer and you have big plans towards each of the methods, right? So I wonder when is the moment in time where it's going to be more typical to see both methods apply in most of the companies that are working, right?
And what I would say is what Ryan and I realize is that sometimes when people start with a jobs problem and then they end up trying to take the jobs and move it down to their old Agile system, it doesn't work. So when we upgrade the demand side, you got to upgrade the other side. And then a lot of times when they want to upgrade the supply side, they don't have the jobs. They need to actually use the jobs. So we're both, like, we're building an interdependent system, but at the same time, the reality is, like, it starts with a struggling moment, and it depends whether it's a product side struggle or whether it's a demand side struggle. But once you start to head down that path, my belief, eventually you'll probably end up with the other.
Got it, got it. Now we have talked about sales, and imagine, okay, right now, how do we train people? Imagine they are starting to use jobs to be done. So I will try to divide this question into two. So what is your recommendation to start using jobs to be done? What
Yes.
is the first step like you would recommend? Because I assume as everything, you cannot just suddenly make a change and everything change, right? And it's perfect. And also, how would you train salespeople to have this mindset? Because I think most of the salespeople, their mindset is again talking about features, capabilities,
Yep.
and even selling capabilities that don't exist, right?
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
think there is these jokes in the internet that yeah, they are selling stuff and the
Yep.
product people is not happy.
And I think the other thing is they end up using it. They use a probability model of that. There's only certain deals I can close. So the number of deals I can close it's just about running the numbers type of thing. So the first thing to get started in jobs to be done, what I would tell you is you have to actually appreciate that the struggling moment is the seed for all innovation. If you really don't buy into that notion that people have to struggle to buy your product, like if there's no struggling moment, there's no interest in your product. What I say is we are just too busy as human beings, and we're too much of habitual people that I show you a product and you kind of look at it and go like, yeah, no. But the reality is like if you have a struggling moment, the way Clay would say it is, questions create spaces in the brain for solutions to fall into. And so a struggling moment is the thing that hollows out that space for something to fall into. And so ultimately, you've got to be able to understand the struggling moment. So to get started is what I would say is like at the very fundamental level is look at the last three big purchases you made and understand and take the time to figure out how did those struggling moments come and occur, and how did you actually figure out how to actually scratch your own itch? Like, how did you decide that you needed that car and not any other car? What trade-offs did you have to make to do it? So being self-reflective on yourself to be able to understand, like, you just didn't randomly buy anything, right? The second is once you actually realize that that's how you work, you can start to realize that's how other people work too. And so you can start to think about your product and what people didn't randomly buy your product, what had to happen to them that caused them to be ready to buy your product. And once you can frame it through that job, that helps a lot. But now that you have that mentality to train the salespeople in it, it's about actually them realizing like, it's not any one thing you say, it's not any one thing you do. It's like, what are the things that need to happen to the prospect for them to be ready to become a customer? And ultimately realizing that their job is to be more of an investigative journalist or a criminal or intelligence interrogation artist than it is about showing up and throwing up all the features and benefits, right? And the way that we've been trained to, so think of it this way is we have all these MBA programs, and in the MBA programs, they have market analysis, they have strategy, they have product, they have operations, they have HR, but no one teaches sales in an MBA program. Why in the world is that the case? Like I've done 7 startups and the hardest thing that I've ever had to do in any one of my businesses is sales. So why is there no sales taught in business school? And you start to realize is that they think that it's more of a psychology thing. And so I wrote my book, Demand Side Sales, to say like, no, there's a theory behind how people buy, and we don't need selling is our response to how they buy. But we need to actually set up the sales process to how they want to buy and make progress. And once you see that, now all of a sudden the salespeople can actually understand that they don't need to show the product. They need to actually uncover the real struggling moments that people have that make them ready to buy your product. So it's not about the feature, it's about what the feature can do for them. That's really important. And once you know that, then the fact is whether you have the feature or not, it's about knowing how to shape the product to get fit and help them make the progress.
How does differ the sales process, at least from your perspective, from the traditional one that we have now with these funnels and so on, to a sales process based on jobs to be done? I know, of course, about the interviews at the beginning, right? But is this something that you will keep doing or?
Yeah. So I believe that the sales process is a supply side concept. It's how we want to sell. It's the process we have to sell. But conversely, on the demand side, it's the buying process of how they want to buy. And we need to make sure that the buying process mimics the sales process. And 9 times out of 10, we actually have a sales process that is independent of how people want to buy. And it's not actually thought out about how people want to buy. And so you start to realize that at some point, the sales process is then treated as if a probability theory, which is, I get 100 leads, which get me to 22 proposals, which gets me to 14 meetings, which gets me to, 3 closes. And so they treat the whole thing as if it's probability. And my thing is no, the reality is like some people are ready to buy, some people aren't ready to buy, and you need to understand what has to be in place for them to say today's the day they're willing to buy. So we study the people who have already bought so we can understand the signals that we have to have along the way to know how it is. To be honest, the thing is the only way out of a funnel is out the bottom, right? The reality is that it's more like it's a timeline. And the fact is they start at one point and they start to move through the timeline. And all of a sudden something happens. They might move back in time because all of a sudden they went from, I'm ready to buy to literally COVID happens. And now I'm back in passive looking. It doesn't mean the problem is solved. There's new context wrapped around them that changes the way they think about what they're supposed to buy. And so part of this is to realize that the buying process is literally, it's a linear process, but people can go back and forth in it versus the sales process where people only progress to the next level each time. And very rarely does somebody go backwards in a sales funnel.
Is there any advice towards, because of course it's not only sales, right? In any company, it's not only the salespeople, right, collaborating to try to close deals. It's also marketing and so on. So, and of course the product itself, right? So how does it look, that collaboration from your perspective in an ideal company between marketing, sales, and the product team to achieve that people go in that timeline?
Yeah. So this is actually interesting. I'm starting to see more people talking about this. Is that I think about it as handoffs. The handoff from marketing to sales is leads, and then the handoff between sales and customer success is the contract. And so you start to realize that everybody's trying to button up those two handoffs. But the reality is like I need marketing's help all the way back in customer success because I need to actually all the people that I sold. There's a whole bunch of people I didn't sell and have no idea what I am, and I need marketing's help to bring them on board. And so you start to realize that and what happens is there's more friction between sales, marketing, and customer success than there is with your competition. And so what happens is we end up spending more time arguing with each other than figuring out how to serve the customer. So the moment you actually start to think about the progress the customer is trying to make and you focus on the customer, the handoff become irrelevant. I'm a big proponent of saying marketing, sales, and customer success need to fall under one executive, and it needs to be one process, because it's ultimately the trade-offs between them are what has to be made. And sometimes marketing has to be a little bit less efficient to be better at sales, or sometimes sales needs to be a little bit inefficient to deal with what's happening in marketing. And ultimately, when you actually break them apart, they end up competing with each other for resources and they don't work very well.
Yeah, something to remark from this answer, you mentioned efficiency, right? Because I even listened to one podcast from you guys before arriving to this place and record, and you were talking about that we maybe are too focused in efficiency, but actually we need some kind of balance between that chaos, or you need something in the middle or somewhere, right?
So here's the case. So like if I look in the US, we have two very big industries that are so efficient they can't be effective. One is the healthcare industry and the other is the education industry. As you find that they have not left any room for innovation. They have not left any room to try new things. And so what happens is the fact is they're so now efficient that they can't innovate. And so they're stuck at where they're at. And so we need a difference between being efficient and being effective. And too much efficiency is actually bad. And I think being too effective and not being efficient at it is also a bad thing. But we need some room to be able to do both. I always say we should be reserving 20% of our time to be better. 20% of our time should be out there to try to figure out how to do something better than we did yesterday. And if we're not spending that time, the fact is we might be very efficient, but ultimately this is why HR is structured the way it is, because it's trying to make the efficient organization as opposed to the effective organization.
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic because, of course, this is a typical discussion even on LinkedIn, right? Like there is a Scrum and all these processes, and people is always talking about what is better. But at the end of the day, as you mentioned, this fight between sales and marketing, that's irrelevant. What is important is to focus in the customer timeline.
That's right.
So,
that's exactly right. And you end up the way I think about it is, if I look at the politics of an organization and I say, where do you spend most of your time? And salespeople going like, God, I wish I had better leads. If I just got better leads, I could close better. It's like, okay, then why aren't you working with marketing to help you do that? It's like, well, they're a different organization. I got to do what I got to do. They got to do what they got to do. It's like, no, you're one organization. And so what happens, you spend all your time arguing with marketing. And the reality is competition is eating your lunch.
Yeah, but it's also about how the corporate is building the incentive, right? Because the
Correct.
metrics and everything is only about this, as you mentioned,
That's
these
right.
percentages, and then I like to hit the quota, so I don't focus into the other stuff.
That's right. Again, you have to remember, planning is guessing. People are making shit up. And then we're held accountable to that guess. And the reality is that to me is why planning is a very, very difficult thing. And I appreciate we need projections, but all of it roots back to basically finance and wanting to be able to protect cash flow. And so I appreciate that the fact that we need to do that, but I would much rather talk about budgets or reserving capacity and goals than talking about basically having to hit certain things, because at some point I can actually do that, but like, what am I hurting by reaching that goal when I hurt somebody else's goal? And so you start to realize that, I think Drucker said it best, is like, sometimes the organization doesn't have to work at 100% efficiency to be effective. But the reality is 9 times out of 10, if it's very effective, if it's very efficient, I can almost guarantee it's not going to be effective.
Got it. So maybe before moving to the next topic and give some time to your new book, Job Move, because we have dedicated a lot of time to the jobs to be done. But yeah, I wanted to mention, I know that I forgot the question, so I will have to remove this part because there is too many topics in my mind right now. Yeah, I will try to find it because I think it was important. Maybe, because we talk about that a long time, but you mentioned that, for example, jobs to be done, it's not that helpful with, for example, insurance, but companies. But is there something else where it's not that effective? For example, I was wondering, for example, with deep tech companies, which are cutting edge, new technologies coming, maybe it's not something I need at the moment, right? So you will still approach in some way jobs to be done with the tech companies?
So the way I approach that is there's a lot of cases where people don't have their product yet and they're trying to build something, or they have a situation where they're building a whole bunch of technology and they don't know what to do with it. And what I would tell you is that I tend to look at where are the struggling moments in the future. So again, the beauty of innovation is every time you solve one innovation, where one innovation solves a problem, it actually always creates another. So think of Apple, right? In the beginning, it was about basically combining a PDA, a music player, and the internet, right? And a phone. It actually didn't do any of those very well, right? But people were willing to say it was good enough to have all three, then carry 3 different devices, right? And then we had basically the very first one had huge signal problems. I mean, the antenna was horrible. They had basically, and so what happens, the first thing they did is they got a lot of drop calls. You can see that, the competition was up against basically trying to say like the iPhone sucks at being a phone. So they made it a better phone. They changed the antenna. They basically wrapped it inside it. They did a whole bunch of really new things. The other thing is that with the internet, they started to actually get faster speeds. And so they could do more things on the phone, right? And then ultimately, the processor became the limiting factor because it was too slow. And so they actually started to upgrade the processor. And then from there, they actually upgraded then the battery because the battery became too low that you had to carry cords around. And then it turns out that the camera was the weakest link. And so they started to upgrade the camera, right? And so you start to realize, like, at some point in time, if Apple never set out to build the best camera in the world, though they did. And so part of it is to start to think about what is the underlying technologies. And to be honest, they could have built a better camera earlier on, but the underlying infrastructure behind it couldn't have supported it. There wasn't enough memory. There wasn't enough battery. There wasn't enough data. And so you start to realize, as you start to see these things coming together, there's a method I use called driving forces, where you look at how the lines of evolution of technology then feed to basically understand where the next opportunities lie. And so it's that aspect of being able to understand those struggling moments and what are they and what are the implications of them and playing them out. So most people build a roadmap around the notion of the features they're going to build next. But really good companies, they don't use features. They talk about the next set of struggling moments, because Look, the moment that AI came out, everybody had to change the roadmap because nobody had AI on the roadmap, right? But the reality is, if
Yeah.
you had a struggling moment on the thing, it's like, oh, how do I use AI to fix this struggling moment? All of a sudden, they could use it. And so you start to realize that when you have a product-focused roadmap, that's not, instead of a customer-focused roadmap, which is the struggling moments you're going to go after, because at some point you don't know the feature set you should build. Like, they want me to predict 24 months from now what the features are going to be of the product. That's insane. That's just insane to think about that. And so I make a guess, and then what happens is then management holds me accountable to that guess.
Mm-hmm.
And then literally, 12 months from now, I'm going to go like, oh, we should change it. But then I have to go change everybody's expectations. So I spend all this time fixing something that I shouldn't have committed to in the first place. That's just, that's to me about efficiency and effectiveness. They think if I can predict the future, which, let's be clear, no one can predict the future. No one can do that. There's nobody in the world has been seen to do that. And so we have to realize that every discussion about the future is a guess, and we need to treat it with that respect that it is a guess, not that it's true.
Well, that brings
Sorry,
me
I got
to
on my soapbox there. That's
no, yeah, but
I have a hard time with people always trying to say, oh, I got to change my plan because and then it's like another 6 weeks of work to basically communicate to everybody you're changing the plan.
yeah.
Come on.
Yeah, I feel the same, so I understand you. The frustration into that because I've been part of companies like that, and then I need to inform the board members, and then all the politics and all the... It's painful. But this brings me actually to remember the question I wanted to do as well. Like, yeah, what is your advice? Imagine someone is listening to us on this topic. They love jobs to be done, or at least the initial idea of it, and they want to... Yeah, how do they communicate this to their managers and to the leaders if this is coming bottom up about, hey guys, there is this methodology, there is this context, and I believe this can be useful because we are having this struggling moment. So yeah, how do you approach that communication from this person? Or you will just advise them, well, if you cannot convince them, just quit the company?
No, not at all. What I would tell you is it sounds very meta, but the notion is how do you understand the struggling moments of your managers? Because their struggling moments, ultimately, they can't find a solution if they can't talk about a struggling moment. So if they're not struggling with the way they see the market, if they're not struggling with basically launching products, if they're not struggling with meeting deadlines, the reality is like they're not ready for anything. So part of it is figuring out what they're struggling at and understand the language they use wrapped around it, and then talk about, well, here's a way in which we could actually solve that struggling moment through understanding jobs to be done. And so connect the problem, connect jobs to be done to a problem that can help them make progress. That's the only way I know how to do this. Mm-hmm. So it's, again, I drink my own Kool-Aid, and so it sounds very circular, but the reality is like, the more I can understand your struggling moment, the more I can understand whether I can help or not. So like when I have prospects come to me, they'll say, oh, I want to use jobs to be done. And I always say the first rule of jobs to be done is not to talk about jobs to be done, is to talk about the customer. Yeah. So my whole thing is what are you struggling with? And then they'll him and haw like, no, but we want to do jobs to be done. Like, but what are you struggling with? Like, what do you think? Let's wave a magic wand. Let's pretend we're going to install jobs to be done. What can you do today that you couldn't do yesterday? That's what I want to know. That's what you need to know. And so ultimately, I would say, don't talk about jobs to be done. Talk about the struggling moment and the progress they want to make, and let jobs be done be the fuel to help you get that, to make that progress.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. So thanks for that reminder, because is this saying like, as we were talking about sales, is this saying if you try to approach the sales talking about features, right? Is more or less the saying, and you keep
That's
approaching.
Exactly right. It's exactly right. So, but sales is like, the funny part is that, so my book, Demand Side Sales, I realized that teachers sell the lesson to the student. And so if the teacher can't actually understand the context the student is in, it's impossible for the student to learn. And the doctor sells the diagnosis to the patient. They don't, help the patient get better. The patient helps himself get better through the diagnosis. And so you have to realize that almost everybody sells every day by helping other people. And so you have to realize that this is the framework that I've been using for years. And so when I go teach a class, the first thing I do is I ask about the students. when we got on this podcast, the first, tell me about the audience. What are they struggling with? What are they doing? What are they not doing? And so that's how I learn how to tailor my message, because I can empathize with the struggling moments that your listeners have.
Yeah, as you mentioned, empathy is a key
Yes.
word and stuff over here. Do you have any list of companies using this mindset from your perspective, or do you track this in some way based on what you work?
So I do, but I will say that to give you the best examples, I think Intercom is one of those companies. I think Basecamp is another one of those companies. I think Intuit is another one of those companies. There are companies out there who have been doing this a very long time, and it's embedded in the way they think and what they do, that I'm not even sure you would recognize jobs to be done inside Intercom. But the fact is, it's the foundations of a lot of it are based in that realm. And so you'd start to realize, like, if you look at like I think they just came out with, who has the best product people. I saw this thing. I think it was on Lenny's podcast, and he talked about like turns out that Intercom has one of the best set of product people ever, because they know jobs to be done like it's just part of their DNA.
Yeah, I was wondering more. Of course, maybe there is no one implementing step-by-step ideas, but like the mindset is the most important
I think
stuff,
it's more
right?
the mindset. I don't believe, like, so for example, people, like, I'm helping companies reinvent their innovation process, right? And people want to say, well, tell me what your innovation process is. And I'm like, I can't, because at some point the innovation process is dependent upon your capabilities, who you are, the industry you're in, and the competitors you have. And so for me to come back with some generic version of how to innovate, it literally never works. And so the fact is what we need to do is actually figure out, why do you need to innovate? What are you trying to innovate on? What are the dimensions of innovation they have to work on? And what are the skills and capabilities you need to build to basically execute on that? And so that's very frustrating for big corporations, because they want me to have the answer, and I don't have the answer. I have the way to get the answer.
Got it. So since we are close to finish for today, if may I ask you, well, I will try to have 2 or 3 questions more, if that's okay for you.
Oh, it's fine.
Good. So, well, let's maybe move to your latest book to have a time for it. So, yeah, what is the knowledge or insights that you want from the readers out of this book?
So
maybe 1 or 2.
I think the first thing is so I wrote it with 2 Harvard professors. One is Ethan Bernstein from the Harvard Business School, and Michael Horn, who's from the Education School. Ethan comes from the organizational behavior side. Ethan comes from the organizational behavior side, and Michael comes from the Education School. And it's work that we've done together. We've built a class around it. We've done these other things. But the first premise is, as an employee, you have way more agency, way more flexibility than you think you do. And so the first thing is this premise of that you as an employee hire companies more than companies hire you. So let's talk about employees, and then we'll talk about employers second, right? So the big insight is that most people end up doing 80% of the work they hate for the 20% of the work they love. So there's all this, what they call it, the grind. And sometimes it's as bad as 95% of the work you hate for 5% of the work you love. And ultimately, people then say, all right, I really need to go. I really hate this job. I'm going to do something else. And they switch jobs, and they switch into a situation where they're in exactly the same situation they were in. It's just a different company, because they think a company change is going to be different. And so part of this is a process to help you start to study yourself, literally to take the time to reflect on, where are there moments that give you energy? What do they happen? Who are you with? What's going on around you? Where do you walk into a situation where you walk out with more energy than when you walked in? Those are special, special moments. And what you start to realize is they exist in your current job. They've existed in your past jobs, but trying to actually start to take inventory of those moments where you understand how energy drives you. Conversely, we have to also understand those things of where energy sucks the life out of you. So those moments where you walk in and you might be excited, and all of a sudden, next thing you know, you're like, oh my God, this is horrible. Because this notion of energy drivers and drains becomes actually the part of the guidance system to help you understand what your skills are, what you like to do, what you're wired for, right? And so part of it is to actually then start to think about your strengths. So one of the things we talk about is strength finders is, Most people have like 10 top strengths and they have 5 bottom weaknesses. But the reality is like those weaknesses are connected to your strengths. So when somebody tells you to get better at something you suck at, it actually makes you, it does this. So you suck at this and you're really good at this, but when you get better at this, it actually brings your strengths down. So every time you work on a weakness, you actually become more mediocre, right? And so because it really robs you of your superpower. And so part of it is being able to understand kind of that dynamic and then start to think about what kind of work can you do that you would really love to do. And so we actually bring the notion of products. So we're treating you as the product by understanding what are your struggling moments, what progress are you trying to make, and then ultimately we start to think about, let's go prototype 3 or 4 different, really different, or 5 different jobs you could get and understand what it's like to be in those jobs. So we talk about informational interviews where you go talk to people who have the jobs that you want. Crazy, because some people will say, oh yeah, I'm in finance and I'm in marketing and, I really hate my job. And they'll say I'm at Fidelity and I want to move to Vanguard. They end up being the same job. But at some point, if they're in marketing, maybe they could go to CPG, maybe they could go to software, maybe they could go to not-for-profit. And so part of it is to think about, and ultimately in marketing, it's about interfacing with the customer. So maybe it's about doing research, maybe it's about doing other pieces. So we actually get people to think much wider about their possibilities and then go talk to people who have those jobs. Not that you want their job, but to understand, look, does the work they do, would that drive you? And what's the shitty work that they have to do to actually get to the good work they like to do? And so out of it, you actually help people prototype kind of where they want to be. And then they start to write around and start to target places where they could actually do the work they love to do and have less about the work they hate to do. On the employer side, which is crazy, is job descriptions are made up. They are made up. And then we try to get people to fit that job description. When the reality is we should probably get job descriptions to fit people and take away the 4 things they suck at and give it to somebody else, because for everybody who loves to do something or hates to do something, there's somebody who loves to do it. I have an accountant who loves to do numbers, absolutely loves to do numbers. It's to the point where like she loves to do numbers so well that the fact is like I pay her more than she wants to be paid. And she goes, why do you pay me more? I said, because I hate this so much. It's so valuable to me. And the reality is like, I will be your last customer. If you're going to quit, you're going to really think about, do I want to quit from me? Because you add so much value to me. Realizing that building teams is about actually building the diversity of skills, the diversity of thinking, the diversity of aspects of what people are doing. And when you actually build a team that's more diverse, you're actually able to do way more work and have way more fun. And so this to me is what, when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, that's what we're talking about. Diversity of perspectives, diversity of skills, somebody who's not the same as me, but is the opposite of me. My business partner for 25 years is the exact opposite of me. What I love to do, he hates to do. What he loves to do, I hate to do. And to be honest, we've become best friends to the point where we have never worked. We worked together apart for 6 months, and we'd vow we'd never work apart ever again. And so to me, part of this is when you're building teams, you got to know what people are good at and what progress they want to make. And so that's what this book is about, is it's outlining both the employee side of helping you find your way and what's your next gig, what's your next thing, and ultimately helping employers realize that building teams is about actually finding people who love to do the work that you need to get done, as opposed to just finding a body who has experience in it. Because what we're finding is people have a lot of experience in things, but they actually hate to do the stuff you want them to do.
Yeah, exactly. As a follow-up of this, so from the employer perspective, so what do you think needs to change in the process of HR? Because I think, as you mentioned, right, the job description is just made up. So is it normal that we will keep into this process and go into this a lot of interviews and so on?
I'm pushing very hard, but I'm an outsider to the HR community. But here's the thing is, what does 5 years experience mean? What does it mean? And what if I have 4 years experience, but I can do everything you want on this thing? Does that mean I shouldn't apply? And so you start to realize that they've gotten lazy in designing the requirements. So think of it as a product. Like if a job description is a product, is a requirements document for a product, it's how we did it in the 80s. Oh, I need to have this and it needs to have that, and you need to have this and you need to have that, but not telling me what I'm supposed to do. It's a bunch of features with no job. So it doesn't tell me the work I'm supposed to do. So I believe that we need to start changing the way we think about job descriptions. And to be honest, I feel like HR is when legal and finance had a baby, they called it HR.
Yeah, sorry, but I need to answer to one person here. Yeah, sorry, I think your bag is in the reception. I gave it to the receptionist she were having, but just check behind the counter or something. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, sorry, is that
That's all
before
right.
I arrived here, there was a bag and I needed to
Yeah,
move
yeah,
it
yeah, yeah, yeah,
to.
yeah, yeah. No problem.
Sorry for that.
So anyway, I think the fact is that we have to realize that at some point in time, the employer side has to change as well. I would say we haven't written that book. We've written parts of it into this book, but I believe that there's a big book to help hiring managers and training hire managers how to write job descriptions and how to learn how to match people to jobs as opposed to trying to make people fit the job description that is a made up set of requirements.
Got it. Yeah.
Right? Like, think of it.
Yeah.
They just don't spend a lot of time thinking about what a job description is. They literally go to the internet, find out, I need a product manager. Okay, what's a product manager do? Oh yeah, this, and but they're not thinking about what they need that person to do really.
Yeah. So even that you are not putting all the context of your company, right? Because a product manager in company X can mean something,
Exactly.
right? But then in this company means
But
something
that's
completely
where
different.
we have a product category of there's water bottles, right? Well, there's a lot of different water bottles, but the fact is at some point in time, what's the context I need to be in? And if you say all product managers are the same, that's not true either. And so
Exactly.
this is where you need to bring context, right? Context and outcomes to the basic to job descriptions, and we need to start to train both the employees. I look at it as a two-sided problem, two-sided market problem. I've got to help employees be more understanding of who they are and what they want. And I need employers to actually be the same thing, who they are and what they want. And if I can actually get that, right now, when they're automating innovation at the very top level, when we need to actually get way deeper and understand how to make the real connection.
Exactly. So now to follow up to other topics, so is there any books, events, or mentors that you advise to people to follow regarding jobs to be done or
Yes.
in general?
Number one is Ryan Singer. If you don't know who Ryan Singer is, please follow Ryan Singer. I always say he's an 84-year-old man in a 35-year-old body. He is wise way beyond his years, and he's an amazing individual, and he's one of the deepest thinkers I know. Another is there's a book that I highly recommend all the time. It's called The End of Average. It's by a gentleman by the name of Todd Rose. And that book, I'm in the midst of listening to it. I listen to it every year. I've listened to it for the last 10 years. It's every time I listen to that book, when my context changes, I hear new insights out of it. And so it's one of those rare books that you can read over and over and over again, and you get something different from it every single time. And it's the aspect of that things are jagged and things are not, averages don't actually help us, and that they actually obfuscate the reality from us. And so how we use numbers and data is very, very important. But at the same time, where our traditional methods of looking at the world is actually very limited. I would say that from a book perspective, there's two books from Clay Christensen I would recommend. One is The Innovator's Dilemma, which talks about the fact of, as you build as you're a startup, how do you actually, how do you become David to beat Goliath? He has all the stories and all the mechanisms of what you have to do as a small new startup to take down the incumbent. And then the other one is How Will You Measure Your Life, which is one that I abide by, which is one of the aspects that Clay has embedded in me. Was the fact is that I measure my life by the number of people I help. And so that's why I do podcasts like this. This becomes a forum to be able to actually help a lot of people without having to have direct contact. And your listeners can actually help, contribute to me being able to help the world by sharing my knowledge. So that's really what I would advise.
Good. Then, as just to finish in another topic apart from product building and so on. So I'm just curious, Bob, so what do you do apart from building products, or this attach all of your time? Do you have any hobbies or something that people can?
So I have 4 children. I've done 7 startups or 8 startups now, and I have 1 wife. I'm most proud of my 1 wife. And so I spend a lot of time with my wife. We ski with the
Good.
kids. I don't know if we're going to get so much skiing in this year, but the fact is like, it's one of those hobbies that I love to be able to be out in nature and be with my family and spend time with my family. Most of my books are written to help pass the knowledge down to others, but I have a book called Choosing College. I have a book, Job Moves, are all really about helping my children kind of figure out how to navigate the world. And so I would say my one hobby is my family.
Great, great. That's a good way to have a hobby, right? The family, of course, is first. Now, is there something that we haven't talked today, or even a remark of all the conversation you want to leave for the last minute?
So I always usually kind of lead with this, is that I have a phrase that I say all the time, that context creates value and contrast creates meaning. And it's one of those things where if you try to tell me about a situation and you don't give me enough context, I can't actually understand how to create value in it. And that value, context creates as much value as the product, because I can have the wrong product in the wrong situation, or the right product in the wrong situation, and it just doesn't work. And so context adds a lot of value, and to never to not start spewing until you actually know the full context. And that contrast creates meaning, which is, most people always want to make a product that's better, but sometimes by making it worse, you actually learn a lot. And failure is the best teacher of all the things we can do. And so I think about making sure that we need contrast in our lives to actually appreciate our life better. So like two of my children live in California. It rains out there, and it's like, oh my God, their whole day is ruined, right? And what I will tell you is that I live in Detroit, Michigan, where it rains and it snows and it's sunny and it's like all the different weather. And I've learned that contrast helps me appreciate the really sunny days, but it also helps me appreciate the snowy days. It helps me appreciate the rain, all the different things. So contrast creates meaning for me. And so I would say that always try to strive for those two things.
So, Bob, thank you very much for the entire conversation today. It was a pleasure. So, is there any place that you want to finish today and mention people where they can find you?
Best place to find me is on LinkedIn, Bob Moesta, Moesta. I have a YouTube channel. I have a couple of other things. I've had a couple of podcasts. I'm on a podcast hiatus right now, but I prefer to be on other people's podcasts because it's easier. But I have one that's called Jobs to Be Done Radio. That's probably about 4 or 5 years old. They're all still relevant. And then I have another one called Circuit Breaker, where it's me and Greg talking about kind of just our thinking and how we think about things, that are both very useful for people. But LinkedIn is the best place to find me.
Yeah, so thanks. Yeah, I highly recommend also the podcast. I listened to few of your posts, and even if they are short, but they are really valuable in the in the content.
They're dense. They're very dense, that's for sure.
Exactly. So again, Bob, thank you very much for
Thank
your
you,
time,
Ricardo.
and all the best in your journey. And well, I hope to still even keep in touch and hopefully help that to be jobs to be done applying in multiple struggling moments all around the world.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me on today.
Yeah, see you.